Hello. It's an honor to be here today and to speak to you about governance. And the title of this talk is There is no decentralization without governance. I mean, that might seem like a bit of a flippant statement, and to some people it might even seem like a paradox. Probably less so in this community, I would guess, since MultiversX has committed to implementing on-chain governance. Now, just to speak a little bit of my background, I've been a full-time cryptocurrency researcher since 2013. And obviously back then I was a big fan of Bitcoin. And later on I was a big fan of Ethereum as well. And my background in particular is in political philosophy. It's one of my areas, at least, of specialization. And something that I've seen in Ethereum and Bitcoin is how a cryptocurrency, how a blockchain can actually be brought down by bad governance. How leadership, even within a decentralized network, can actually centralize. And I think this is a major, major concern. Actually, I even think this is one of the biggest problems that we have in cryptocurrency. It's able to pervert and corrupt a blockchain. It's able to change and pivot the roadmap of a blockchain. You know, we talk a lot about the value of decentralization. But is a blockchain truly decentralized if, practically speaking, only a few people have the final say over the direction of that blockchain? I would argue that a blockchain is not truly decentralized, if that's the case. And this is where on-chain governance comes in as a solution to this problem. Not as an overarching, tyrannical structure that's going to dictate rules. You know, politics, good governance, is about mitigating the effects of power, influence, corruption, and perversion. So we really have to think about governance in the sense of how do we set up systems that protect the freedom, that protect the underlying principles of blockchain technology, or of that underlying blockchain. I think that's a very important point to drive home. Because what I've seen both in the case of BTC and Ethereum, there is this idea of quote-unquote social consensus. This idea that somehow decisions are a part of some sort of perfect egalitarian meritocracy. I'm here to tell you that that's a fantasy, and it's a very dangerous one, because what it really does is it empowers shadow rulers. It empowers people behind the scenes to be making decisions about the direction of that blockchain. And this, I think, is one of the biggest threats to cryptocurrency. In other words, I don't even see the big threat to cryptocurrency coming from outside. It's not regulators. It's not rogue states. It's not any of these things. The biggest threat to blockchain and to this movement is ourselves. It comes from within. We are our own worst enemy. And this has been the case in a lot of political thought for a very long time now, that we've realized these dynamics of human nature, that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. This is why we need systems of on-chain governance. I can't stress this enough, how important this is. And just as an example of what it looks like when you don't have on-chain governance, I think, effectively speaking, I would argue, in the case of BTC, and a bit less so in Ethereum, but this is still the case in Ethereum, I suspect if you get, say, 20 or maybe 10 of the right people in a room together behind closed doors, and you get them all to agree to a particular course of action, and then they come out with that course of action publicly, then guess what? That's the direction the blockchain is going to go. Is that decentralized? Is that the future of money? Of course it's not. I think that's a preposterous position to take. But yet, the two largest blockchains are governed in this way, through the clients, through developers having the final say. Because there is no other mechanism for decision making. You're basically at the mercy of developers to do what they want to do, whether that's good or bad. And I would argue that such centralization of power, such lack of transparency, is unbelievably damaging to a blockchain in the long term, because it allows perverse incentives to prosper. Specifically, in the case of both BTC and Ethereum, which for a long time had the promise, had the social contract of, yes, we will scale this blockchain, we will scale the layer 1. Both of these projects pivoted towards layer 2 scaling instead, and totally changed their plans in terms of the direction that blockchain is going into. Now the layer 1 is not scaling in Ethereum. They completely abandoned sharding, execution sharding, in the case of Ethereum. In the case of Bitcoin, they did not increase the block size limit, just like Satoshi always said that we should. Completely changing the vision, the purpose, the utility of that blockchain. I mean, to me, that's a tragedy. I mean, I really believe in this movement, right? I actually see this as a new political tool for freedom. And yet we have these small groups of developers, essentially a type of GitHub dictatorship, if you will, who are dictating the future for all of us. I think that's wrong. And it's even more ironic is that within blockchain technology itself, we have the perfect type of technologies to actually mitigate this problem and solve this problem, to actually govern in a decentralized way, to actually have this type of collective governance that better represents the will of the stakeholders. Now, note there that I did not say the will of the people. And I think I'm going to bite the bullet on this one. I don't actually think that blockchain's governance is democratic or should even aim to be democratic. That's because we can't prove we can't do proof of human. We can't prove that you're a human being. It's easily to sybil a blockchain. This is why proof of work was invented. It was even stated so in the Bitcoin white paper that, you know, if the proof of work mechanism was based on IPs, it would be trivial for someone to just sybil that system. This is why I find it so delusional that some Bitcoiners might even say, well, the majority of the full nodes is the governance of the system. That's a ridiculous proposition, because there's no sybil protection mechanism there. And, you know, having been a researcher for close to a decade and being a believer in this movement was incredibly disappointing. And I really believe that Bitcoin not scaling set the movement back 10 years in terms of global adoption. Ethereum not scaling set the movement back another 10 years in terms of global adoption. The amount of lives that could have changed. Imagine the amount of utility we would have today. All of the use cases that could have flourished that didn't flourish because of these decisions. It's an absolute travesty, if you ask me. And this is why I'm so happy to be part of this community that actually is scaling on-chain and also has made a commitment to on-chain governance. But there are devils in the details here. So I'd like to talk a little bit about what I think best practices for governance should be and what the principles should be of good governance. So let me start with saying I think stakeholder voting is the answer, because it aligns the incentives of people who are invested in the cryptocurrency with decision making. I think it can be compared potentially to a type of equity. You know, in equity, in stocks, the shareholders, the stakeholders, have a vote over the direction of that company. You know, this works for the stock market, this works for equities. I'm going to argue that this will also work for blockchains, or at the very least, this works a lot better than what most blockchains do today, which is this type of dictatorship that is couched in this language of meritocracy and egalitarianism, which really I think is just a smokescreen for the people really in charge. I mean, this might sound conspiratorial, but if you actually look at the facts, I think this is true. You know, the Bitcoin core developers can very easily block any changes from happening, because there's a single dominant client implementation. There's a lead maintainer who has the final say over any code changes. One guy. One guy has the final say over code changes. And this is made even worse considering that within, say, BTC culture, creating a opposing client implementation is seen as a quote-unquote attack on Bitcoin. This is also something we have to remember. There's this intersection between culture and governance mechanism. And what we need to do is try to find that fine balance between the two. Ideally, you can design a governance system that is resistant to this type of manipulation regardless of the pressures on it. But I think that's also somewhat unrealistic in terms of the real politic. So, the first principle here is stakeholder voting. And we already have this in the case of proof of stake. We just have to attach this now to proposal systems. And this is exactly what MultiversX is planning to do as well. And there will be proposals on chains that people can then vote for with their stake. I think this is a fantastic step in the right direction. Absolutely great. However, I suspect that this is not going to be enough. I mean, I don't really know what's going to be enough because all of this is just a giant social experiment. Okay? In the same sense that the United States is also still an ongoing social experiment. All of these kind of social experiments have to be tested in the real world. We can't just think about these things theoretically. We actually have to do them and then see what the results are and then learn from those results. To be an empiricist. To be objective about thinking about governance design. So the way I see it is that we have Bitcoin, which is a very simplistic design. That, in my opinion, has failed for a lot of different reasons. And now I also see, and then we make something more complex. You have something like Ethereum. That fails for a number of different reasons, in my view. Now we go on to the next iteration, which I hope is MultiversX in this case. And who knows, there might be an iteration after that. But the key here is that a blockchain is able to evolve, to find the right balance between being too difficult to change and too easy to change. That's what I call the Goldilocks zones of blockchain governance, if you will. Now, so first principle, stakeholder voting. Second principle, we need proposal systems on-chain so that we have accountability, so that we have transparency. Another principle, and I touched on this earlier, is we need multiple client implementations. I mentioned this before about how software is governed. And I'm here in the hacker room, so I'm sure all of you here know how GitHub governance works. And I think that's fine for a software project. I don't think that's fine for a layer 1 blockchain. I think that's hopefully insufficient for a layer 1 blockchain. And even if you set up all of these wonderful systems of governance, if you just have one client implementation, if you just have one software developer, ultimately they can still act as a gatekeeper to change. Because you still need them to code, you still need them to actually create the technology. Now, I do understand that to have multiple client implementations is you're at least doubling, if not tripling, the workload of development. So this is not a small request. And there is a balance to be struck here as well, because if you do this too early, which, to Ethereum's credit, they did do this early. From the very beginning, they had multiple client implementations. But I understand for a smaller cryptocurrency that this is only something that would come along later in its development, practically speaking. But it's striking that right balance. The same is true for governance. Like if you implement it early, it doesn't actually work. And if you implement it too late, you might not ever be able to implement it because the system would have already been captured. This is what we have to understand. We have to account for human nature. Because if there's a great saying by a person named as Lord Acton, and he said, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And if you give people power over a blockchain, over a layer 1 blockchain, and that blockchain has a lot of importance in the world, that is a form of power. That corrupts people. And even worse is when you have external forces coming in and paying off developers. And this is specifically what I've seen in Bitcoin and Ethereum, where if you look at it, core developers, they get paid a lot more money by developing for layer 2s than they do for layer 1s. That's a clear conflict of interest, be it in the case of Blockstream and Chain Code Labs, which raised hundreds of millions of dollars, which went into the pockets of these core developers. Some of these guys were just living out of a car doing volunteer work. Right? You can see how that's awfully tempting if someone comes along and says, we're going to make you unbelievably wealthy if you just, take shares in this company and, maybe, layer 2s benefit, I think, from a narrative of a layer 1 not scaling. Because the utility of layer 2s is severely diminished if the layer 1 is scalable. I'm not saying layer 2s don't have a place in our ecosystem. I think they do. But I think it's far more niche than most people are making it out to be. Because if you have a scalable layer 1, then you can do it on the layer 1. And it has a much better UX. You get all of the security guarantees. It's a far more direct way. And it's just far more empowering for everyday people. I mean, most layer 2s have admin keys, have all these vulnerabilities baked in. Okay. So I'm going to go on with these principles. And I mentioned this idea of external funding coming in and being this corrupting force. So the same is true in Ethereum in the case of Arbitrum and Optimism. And Arbitrum literally bought a client implementation. I mean, talk about influence, right? Being able to steer a blockchain into a different direction. Now, how do we counteract this force of external funding? And this is something that I don't believe is on MultiversX's roadmap yet. But I actually think self-funding mechanisms are a way to create a layer 1 biased source of funding that can counteract the corrupting force of external funding sources. So specifically, take 5-10% of the block reward, put that in a treasury, and then allow that to fund proposals. This is what I'm suggesting is actually a very important solution for this corruption problem that we're seeing. And other blockchains have done this. Decree, Dash, Tezos. There's a number of blockchains that have implemented this and fairly successfully. I will acknowledge it is it is inefficient. So there's going to be a lot of misallocation of funds. But I would argue this is still far better than allowing your roadmap to be corrupted. Far better. So, self-funding mechanisms also allow you to fund, first of all, for development to be sustainable long-term. That's also very important. And it adds an extra competitive edge because you can also use that funding to help bootstrap adoption. This aligns, token economics and game theory of the system towards, better ends. So, multiple client implementations, self-funding mechanism, stakeholder voting, on-chain proposal systems. Combine all of these things, and I think we have a pretty good shot of pulling this off. But without on-chain governance, we're just at the mercy of the developers. And I love EGLD, I love MultiversX, but I think we have to acknowledge here the reality, right? The amount of influence the founders have, the network of people. This is still governed in a centralized way, even if we do an on-chain vote. And here comes the paradox also. I don't actually think decentralized governance even works at a small scale. This is the dilemma. At a small scale, there's not enough opposing parties to actually make that function. I think what decentralized governance looks like is it looks like drama. It looks like conflict. It looks like competing power blocks competing with each other, thereby creating a balance of power. You can only have that at a much larger scale, at a much higher value of importance. So there's this kind of chicken and egg problem. How do you get a cryptocurrency to that scale if the decentralized governance doesn't actually function the way you want it to function until it reaches that scale? It's like this chicken and egg problem, right? You can't escape that. But if you set it up too late, you won't be able to implement it because the system becomes captured. The system becomes captured by external forces. This is why we need on-chain governance, or it's all just decentralization theater. We have to stop pretending. We need to stop pretending as if this is like this perfectly decentralized system. When you clearly have people in power, you clearly have influential figures who can easily sway the direction of a project. Let's just acknowledge that so that we can fix it, so that we can work towards a future in which blockchains are neutral, where blockchains do represent the will of its stakeholders. You know, and that's the tragedy I'm trying to avoid here. You know, I see history repeating itself in Ethereum, like what happened in Bitcoin. The exact same thing is happening in Ethereum. It's almost exactly the same. You know, and that led me to the conclusion that this is not a one-off case. This is a systemic flaw in governance. Like there's something systemically wrong here. There's perverse incentives that basic blockchain governance mechanisms are unable to counteract. You know, this is one of the biggest tragedies in my view. Not FTX blowing up, not Free Arrows Capital. I mean, my condolences to people who lost money in these scams. But for me, the biggest tragedy, the biggest threat is this massive systemic flaw in governance design. So we have to learn the lessons of history so that we don't repeat them. And Ethereum somehow didn't learn that lesson, which is just unbelievably disappointing to me. And it's part of the reason why I'm here now is I don't want EGLD to make those same mistakes. I don't want in 5, 10 years from now for the roadmap to be perverted over whatever issue it might be. You know, I care about good decisions being made. I care less about fairness, if I'm being honest. I just want the system to generate good decisions so that we can reach that place on the mountaintop, right? I think most of us here actually believe in cryptocurrency. We actually believe in the freedom it creates, in the censorship resistance, in the immutability. You know, there was a report, a study commissioned by the CIA. I think it was like a year or 2 years ago. I don't remember exactly when. And the study basically said, if you read the study, it basically says, okay, the best way that we can pervert, disrupt a blockchain, a cryptocurrency, is by targeting the core developers. And they're completely correct. That is the easiest way right now to disrupt a blockchain. You know, we talk all about, security models. We talk about consensus algorithm. But especially the technically minded people, you know, we forget that these are still human systems. You know, a blockchain is not this automaton. It's not this robot that just does things in this autonomous way. You know, blockchains are made up of people. It's more like I like to make the comparison that's a bit more like a cyborg. You know, it's part machine, part human being. And what we're doing in a blockchain, this is very important, what we're doing is we're aligning human incentives for cryptographic game theory to bring about certain end results. And the mechanisms that I mentioned before, self-funding mechanism, multiple client implementations, on-chain proposal systems, stakeholder voting. These are all critical steps to avoid the tragedy that happened in BTC and Ethereum. Because I thoroughly believe that, yeah, if you get 10 to 20 people in the same room, that's the direction the blockchain is going to go. And that's true for EGLD as well. More excusable because it's smaller, but you know, once it grows, which I think it will, I don't think that's excusable anymore. And there's a danger, right? There's a danger of implementing this too late, because once the system becomes captured, it becomes almost impossible to change. So we have to implement on-chain governance before it even functions correctly, for the time when it will, and for the time when we won't be able to implement it anymore. I understand this is a very tricky proposition. but I think it's absolutely crucial if we want this movement to succeed. Absolutely crucial. And I don't want to see us making the same mistake again. History repeating itself. People becoming corrupted. Even if they believe they have the best intentions. You know, I disagree with that path, and I disagree with those pivots. All right. I'm going to take some questions, actually, from the audience. Would anyone like to ask me a question? Yeah. Just keep it short, and I'll repeat your question for the microphone. Yeah, so the question is, can I explain more about multiple clients, and do they have the same core functionality? Yes, they do. So an example of this in Ethereum might be you have Geth and you have Prism, right? And you have a number of other client implementations. These are basically alternative software packages, and this is very important, developed by competing development teams. Okay, this is very important, because if it's not developed by competing development teams, you're just still dealing with the same power structure. You don't have this dynamic of competing forces. Because if you only have one client implementation, it's a dictatorship, because they have the final say. Because all change in a blockchain has to begin with code. Okay? So the first step is code. The first step is you need to create the code, and then the second step is the stakeholder voting. In the case of proof of stake, it's stake. In the case of proof of work, it's work, right? So, however, if that first step doesn't work, then the entire line of decision-making after that is basically captured. So, without multiple client implementations, we don't actually have any meaningful choice in terms of what direction we're going into. I should mention here there's a third step as well, which is the ability to fork a blockchain, to create a chain split. Now, I think it's very important to mention that I really view this as the nuclear option. You know, the whole point of blockchain governance is to be able to make decisions before you reach a point of a chain split. Because a chain split is incredibly disruptive. It is the thing you do when everything else fails. So the type of blockchain governance I'm talking about is everything leading up before a chain split. I still think chain splits are an important and critical governance mechanism. But I also think it's a failure of a blockchain if it goes to that option immediately. I think, I like to make a comparison here. So in most democracies, there is not a civil war every time after every election. Now, the question is, why don't we have a civil war after every election? Well, that's because most people agree with the process of decision-making, even if they might not agree with the conclusion. So it's having a process of decision-making actually avoids the civil war, avoids a chain split from occurring. And that adds additional unity to a system, which I think is very important in order for a governance mechanism to truly function. That was a great question, thank you. Another question over there.
Hi, yes. I have two questions, but I will do one here and one maybe in person. So related to voting and on-chain governance, how do you see preventing some actors getting more power of voting? Because we are, even right now, if we decide and we even split the world, we see that more than 95% of the wealth, it's in like 0.0 something. And you cannot even write it on a paper to see how many zeros you need to add to actually figure out it's there.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. And you know what? I'm gonna bite the bullet on that one, because there was a great quote by Winston Churchill, and he said that democracy is the best of the worst systems. And what I think he meant by that is that even with all of the flaws of democracy, it's still the best we have. And I feel very much the same about stakeholder voting. Even with all of the flaws of stakeholder voting, it's still the best we have. And I actually agree. This is why I'm saying at a small scale, it doesn't actually work. Because you might have, I don't know, 10 parties that might be able to sway the vote. I mean, that's not very decentralized. Now we're just back to 10 parties, like 10 developers having the final say, right? Exactly. But here comes the kicker, and this is why I talk about the scale of a blockchain. I think our objective should be to grow the blockchain so large that no single party will have power over it, or not even a coalition of single parties will have power over it. And I understand we're not there yet, but I can see a future is through adoption and through greater growth and through more market capitalization and more parties joining this way, we will end up in a situation where there's a greater distribution of stake, where, say, that number might go down to from 10 to 100 to 1,000, right? If we get true decentralization in terms of geopolitical distribution globally, right? Then we would reach a point at which we can say no single party or no cartel can actually swing the vote, even though that is the case now at current stage. You're 100% correct in saying that. But I will bite the bullet on this. I will bite the bullet because I think it's the best option we have. You know, we can't do proof of human. You know, we shouldn't resort to off-chain solutions. We shouldn't just put the developers in charge. So what we're left with is stakeholder voting. And yeah, I thoroughly believe there is no better option than that. And if there is, I would love to hear it. And obviously, we can add additional mechanisms. We can add separate systems, balance of power, divisions of power, and all these type of mechanisms, increasing complexity until we get it right. Yeah, go ahead.
Now, while you're talking, it might be crazy, but an idea just came to me. Maybe we can implement this on the chain so nobody can accumulate that much power.
I'm not sure what you mean by that. Implement on the chain.
Well, you have a governance system, but you can implement rules because the level ones right now, like MultiversX, they're pretty smart. And as far as like coding, you can put a lot of rules there. Well, you can add this rule at the chain level so you don't have any actors that can accumulate more.
Yeah, I don't believe that's actually possible. It's because it's gameable. And there are mechanisms planned for EGLD, and I had a discussion about this yesterday, actually, with some of the core team, that, you know, you could say put in a rule where you say wallets above a certain amount will have less weight in the governance mechanism. Like, that might be an example of what you might be able to do. But I'm afraid to say that that's just trivially gameable. So, you know, if you're a sophisticated actor, you can just split that wallet into multiple parts. And so what you're really doing is you're punishing potentially honest actors who might not be as sophisticated, and you're rewarding potentially sophisticated actors that are able to game the system. So yeah, I would not advocate for any type of mechanism that is gameable. And, you know, this is why proof of stake is so important. Because proof of stake and proof of work, there's a reason why we haven't come up with any other consensus algorithms. It's because this is what allows us to have provable skin in the game. This is what allows the game theory to actually function. So yeah, but you are correct. There are a whole range of different possibilities in terms of what we can code in terms of governance, from committees that can veto decisions, a bit like a Supreme Court, to you know, dividing stakeholders into different parties to create divisions of power, etc. So there's a whole range of different options there. I would say let's start with some of these suggestions that I put forth in terms of these principles of governance, because otherwise we maybe run the risk of overcomplicating things, and then it's hard to also pass, you know, what is working and what's not in a live kind of organic system. It's very difficult to actually figure out, well, why did this fail? The more simple a system is, the more easier that will be to figure out. Thank you. I think I have time for one more question, because I think I'm going a bit over time here, unless... all right, one more question. Where do we have a question? There. Oh, the mic is running over there. By the way, this is a really well-organized event, so yeah, this is great stuff. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I just wanted to ask you, how do you figure out when is the best time to actually introduce these governance features to the public? Because as you mentioned before, it's bad if you introduce them too early, but also too late. So how do you figure out the perfect spot?
I actually think earlier is better than later. So I think in EGLD's case, I think it's good that we're implementing this now. But I do think we just need to acknowledge that it doesn't function the way we want it to function at this scale. I just think that's, I mean, in terms of like trade-offs, you know, it's better to have a governance mechanism that doesn't work now, which means effectively you're still governed by, you know, the influential figures, by the founders, by the foundation, right? You're basically in a similar situation as you were before, but at least you still have some sort of recourse if there is a conflict. So yeah, I would say sooner better than later, and in the case of EGLD, I think now is a great time to do it. And it is doing it, so I think that's fantastic. Yeah. Okay, do I have time for one more question, or should I make my closing argument? Where are the organizers? One more question? Okay, one more question. No one's telling me not to. Okay, who wants another question here? Yeah, over there. Hey, you know, it's...
Hello.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks for being here first, Justin.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you here. What I want to ask is, right now, a proposal was being that the staking agencies, the staking providers, will have the voting power. Now, if we look on the chain, we can see that a small amount of providers will have a lot of power. What if the voting power goes to the actual wallet? Let's say 10 eGold wallet will have 10 voting power, and 10K eGold will have 10K voting power. How would you think about an idea like this?
Oh, I think that's a great suggestion. And if I understand correctly, the EGLD team is actually working on allowing people who delegate their stake to actually make their own individual choices in terms of voting. So, you know, I think it's a fantastic decision, because there are some, you know, issues with staking pools and liquid staking pools and all these type of things. There are issues with that around governance. So yeah, no, I think that's a fantastic suggestion. So yeah, I'm all for it. Okay, so I'll just make a closing argument here, and look, I just want to make clear that the reason why I'm advocating for governance in a blockchain is because I believe in decentralization, and I believe in this movement, and I think that if we don't do this, it's all just decentralization theater. And that's not what I signed up for. I think it's absolutely critical that we make these steps and that we learn from the past. You know, we are our own greatest enemy, and we have thousands of years of political knowledge and history that we can actually apply to blockchain technology today. And we should take advantage of that and embrace a multidisciplinary approach in blockchain design. A blockchain can't just be designed by computer scientists. We need political philosophers, we need economics, we need all these different fields to come together in order to get a holistic view of what it takes to truly build something that will be a defining mechanism in human civilization. And that's what I believe we're building here. We're building a system that will be the future of money, that will be the future of finance, something that will protect privacy, something that will protect human rights. And if we screw this up again, that'll just make me want to cry at the tragedy of it all, because it's just such a spoiled opportunity. You know, let's get this right now. Let's create a system of governance that we can be proud of and stand for. And EGLD really has the opportunity to get this right today. So, thank you everyone for listening to me, and hope you have a great day.